All right, well, thanks for sticking out the full day. I guess this is the last session of the day, so hopefully you guys find some good value here. I'm going to be talking a bit about my company and some of the use cases we've had experience in working in cybersecurity, security analytics, specifically within a big data space based on some AI technology. So I think I got all the obligatory buzzwords in for the conference, but basically we're going to unfold and dig into these a bit more, and I'm going to walk through some actual case studies with you guys. So hopefully make this a bit more real in terms of the kinds of threats that are out there, ways you can detect and mitigate those for your organizations, and hopefully learn something along the way in terms of some of the capabilities that are out there to help make you more effective in your threat hunting as well as securing your networks. So before I jump in, can I just get a sense of what your backgrounds are? So is anybody a security analyst, like you actually work in a SOC or you do analysis of threat data? No? Okay. Do we have anybody here that, do we have anybody? You are, okay, so you got some background then. Do we have anybody here that works, say, in the big data space, building tools or technologies that potentially maybe your security analysts might use or make use of peripherally or directly? All right, I think I've hit the right trend. And do we have any managers, any executives that are tasked with actually protecting your networks and making sure that you have coverage in this space as part of that process? Okay, a couple of those. Perfect. All right, great. It's good to know the background here. So this is a business track talk, so I'm not going to go too deep into technology. I have a bit of math on the slides to talk about, but we won't go too deep in terms of the actual analyst usage or the analyst perspective on this, given the audience we have today. So before I jump into this and give you a bit more background about what I'm going to talk about and where I come from, I just want to talk a bit about big data. And I think this venue is really a good opportunity to talk about some of the concerns that are present within cybersecurity, period. And big data comes into play for two reasons, right? So the first is that most organizations have lots of data. That's the theme here, right? You have your data, you need to monetize it, you need to deliver value from it, you need to innovate or else you're going to get taken out by your competition or be disrupted. This makes you a target too, though, because you have lots of data and attackers, whether inside or outside, want access to that data. And to help mitigate that, we have tons of security products, right? We have, over the last 10 years, the space has evolved a lot. We've got SIEMs just about everywhere now. You've got your DLP systems for data loss protection. You've got your endpoint protection, et cetera, et cetera. And what do those generate? Lots and lots of data. And so your poor analyst team, maybe about 10 years ago where you had 3 or 4 super sharp people, they were able to dig through this stuff and they were really good at finding, the patterns and the behaviors of interest. They are drowning now in the data they have, whether it be false positives or an inability to keep up with all the alerts and thresholds that are being generated. So there has to be a better way. And so I'm going to talk a bit about what we think is a better way to deal with that, and specifically target around a specific type of cybersecurity threat that's really focused around insider threat. So there are tons of cybersecurity threats out there, right? From denial of service to malware infections to spear phishing to et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to be talking about a very narrow space of that because they only gave me 40 minutes to go through that. So just a bit about me and my company, Interset. We've been around for about 3 years in our current state. We've gone through a bit of an evolution, but we're distributed across both Canada and the US. So we're just down the road in Newport in Southern California, and then also based in Ottawa up in Canada. Myself, I'm a former data miner. I had to change the title to data scientist because it's the sexiest job alive. But have been working with data really for about the last 12 years. I got really fortunate to fall into this space back when it was first getting interesting, and actually spent 4 years building machine learning systems for threat hunting. Most of those were based on supervised machine learning, so primarily detecting malware, and really working on the problem of malware that morphed and constantly tried to evade your standard antivirus techniques. So I have a bit of experience in terms of how hard it is to make your threat hunters and your cybersecurity analysts work better, because the last thing they probably want is another tool. They have too many tools, they have too many alerts, and they're trying to figure out, why do I need to go and work with another tool? So we're going to talk a bit about how we think we can actually develop tools and technologies that make their job easier as part of today, but again, some firsthand experience doing that. From a Hadoop perspective, I am not a Hadoop expert in terms of debugging your Flume. The Apache Metron guys earlier today were talking about the pain of Storm. I have ridden in the boat as it was sinking due to the problems of Storm, but I have not been the person plugging the holes in the ship to make it stay afloat. So I will not be helping you debug your Hadoop pipelines, but very experienced in terms of what you can do with this technology and what it enables in terms of the kinds of paradigms that it brings about. My specific role, I'm a field data scientist. So what does that mean? That means I primarily interface with our customers, so I don't do data science in our product. I don't do the model building. I don't get to do the, the fancy mathematics. I get to explain and interpret how that mathematics and data science capability can actually be applied to a customer environment, because it turns out every one of you has a slightly different environment. Even though you're all using AD and you've all got your Blue Coat proxy appliances, they're all a little different. And this really matters in terms of what you do with that data and how you interpret it to help drive efficiency and value for your employees. All right, so let me unpack a bit more about what I mean by AI-based security analytics. So when we talk about AI at my company and in my space, we're not talking about replacing people. So this is not artificial intelligence is going to take away someone's job. This is really about how do you use artificial intelligence to make people do their jobs better. And given that there's not a ton of actual security analyst experience in the room, I would explain this by way of analogy. If I use an example from e-commerce, because everybody knows e-commerce. I recently bought a barbecue through Amazon. You can pick whatever e-commerce retail site you want. And after I bought that barbecue, it kindly suggested to me that I should think about buying a barbecue brush and also a barbecue cover. And what was wonderful about that recommendation engine, aside from the fact that Amazon made a bit more money off me, was the fact that that saved me time. I needed those things. It was part of the parcel. And so rather than me having to go and actually search for these things and actually spend my cycles, my time finding that information and finding the right product, that AI algorithm behind the scenes, that recommendation engine actually figured that out for me, suggested that information, and made my time more efficient. Now that's a very trite example, of course, but imagine you're an analyst and you're constantly searching through your scrolling list of leads and threats to start going through. Wouldn't it be great if the machine was doing more of the work for you and actually telling, hey, you should also look at this? Or here, this contribution of risk factors has actually made this person the most risky person today, or has changed the most over time. These are examples of how AI, machine learning, can really be used to help deliver more value to the person at the end of the day. We're not trying to replace that person, we're just trying to make sure they can get through more work. Because the reality is, for most threat hunting teams, it's all about efficiency. You are never going to get through your full list of all of the alerts you have to investigate, all the different threats you possibly could look at. Your boss keeps telling you, hey, go take some time to go and blue sky some ideas and try to figure out different patterns of behavior you might want to look at. You never have time for that. So the idea here is we want to make it more efficient for you to actually get through the most important things during the amount of time that you have, because these are finite resources. And the problem here is even, potentially more challenging than you might think. So for those of you folks that work in large organizations, I would be shocked if any of you have more than maybe 2 hands worth of people working in your threat hunting and cybersecurity divisions. There are different specialties for sure, but for the most part, you're talking about having handfuls of people tasked with defending the networks and the data of organizations that have hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue and potentially tens of thousands of employees spread across the entire globe. So making them efficient is really important, because they should be tracking and focusing on the most important things. Helping to put this into a bit more of an architecture or a space in terms of where this stuff fits. So on the left-hand side, we have your traditional picture of a traditional security architecture. So, this is like circa 5 years ago. This is kind of the standard thing. So you have all your different endpoint or purpose-built systems, your firewalls, your DLP, your endpoint agents running on your actual devices, whether they be mobile or personal computers. And typically, most of these things are feeding into your SIEM, and your SIEM is tracking certain things it's looking for. So, tons of rules that are being configured, different types of patterns, reports being generated, and you have an army of people that are, you wish you had an army of people that were looking through this to try to find out what they should really be focusing on. And almost always, they might be able to do all their hunting within the SIEM, but often they have to go back to those source systems. They're actually going to go log into the DLP, access the actual person's endpoint, log into the computer, find out what's going on. The new picture that we're looking at here, and for those of you that were at the Metron talk earlier today, you would have seen as well, is we have this wonderful data lake technology, right? We have this Hadoop ecosystem that allows us to work with all of this data, and it's not about replacing necessarily. So our perspective is we are not displacing any of these technologies. They all do what they do. And inevitably in security, one thing you hardly ever see is, I'm going to churn something off. Because inevitably, there's still that threat out there where if you accidentally churn off your firewall that was protecting that Windows XP box you've got sitting around because you have some legacy application, you're going to be in trouble. So we often don't discard these technologies. And so you want to have something that can work with it as opposed to replace it. So that's where we see security analytics playing. That's where we see security analytics playing. So it's something where you can have an additional place to bring together your data so you can look at it in new ways, but you still have the other tools you have in your system to be able to work upon as well for when the situation arises. So I can't drink my water and hold the microphone. So a little bit about the technologies we're on. Again, I'm not going to show any code, but I will talk a little bit about the specific technologies. So we make use extensively of the Hadoop stack, primarily from an ingest perspective. NiFi is our go-to, so it's a fantastic way of bringing in data from all of your different source systems, manipulating and making that data look like what we expect to be able to bring into our system so we can actually run analytical models and make sense of it and actually surface up the relevant stuff, which I'll get into in more detail in a second. But NiFi is a fantastic technology to make use of this here. We have a little bit of Storm as well too, but basically all this stuff feeds into Kafka, which is our primary ingest mechanism. So that's where we buffer everything up, and then from there we start pulling it into our system, primarily into two places. So I don't think this thing has a pointer. Oh, there we go. So we primarily pull the data into two places. So we put it into Elastic, where we index all this data so you have access to the raw information eventually down the road, and I'll talk about that in a second once we get down to it. The other place we primarily persisted it is within HBase. So HBase is a fantastic distributed technology we can use to actually build the analytical models that drive our anomaly detection that allow us to then surface the most likely leads. And I'll talk about that in more detail, but those are sort of the two persistence layers if you can think about. We've got data coming into Kafka that's being pulled from those source systems, and it's being fed into both HBase as well as Elastic. And then in between, we're using technologies like Storm and Spark as our analytics engine. So this is where we're actually applying the logic that's implementing these AI models. So how we actually parse and process the data to pick out the patterns of behavior that are of interest. And I'll talk a bit more about that in detail down the road. And then again, on the right side, I mentioned Elastic already. This is where you can actually drill into stuff. So again, all of the analytics, all the Spark jobs are really trying to surface where should you focus your energy, and then you can drill into the details because inevitably, giving you an alert that says, hey, Joe got a score of 95, something risky, that means nothing to you as an analyst. You need to have context. And the way we provide context is by actually having the individual alerts and events that were actually brought into the system available through Elastic and Kibana, so you can actually drill into this information and make a judgment call. You're probably also going to go take a look in your DLP system if it's worthy of an investigation, or actually log into their machine, do all your standard stuff as part of that analysis, making it easier for you to provide all of that context without having to switch workstations or switch windows or switch what you're logging into. We find this really does help, again, when it's about efficiency and making sure you're spending your time on the right kind of problems. All right, so they revoke my data scientist card if I don't have at least one formula on the presentation. This math is not entirely accurate, so please don't pick me apart because the summation terms are not correct. Plus, I couldn't actually put the proper formula up there. Our IP folks wouldn't let me do that. What I want you to take away from this is that we are actually using fairly simple math as the basis of the machine learning models, the AI that's powering our product. So I want to walk you through it in a bit of brief detail if I can. So the first piece that really matters for how we surface anomalies, and I'll talk more about the type of machine learning and all that stuff in a second, but the first piece is how we evaluate the risk of an event or an activity. So something that happens. Roy emailed 10 megabytes of data to mail@roy.com. Or I attempted to authenticate to a domain via a domain controller in Japan. Or I tried to mount a file share that I never had before. Those are the basic events that are going on that are actually involved as part of the basic records, if you will, and the logs that we're actually consuming from the source systems. So the way that we evaluate the risk of these actual events, those individual pieces of telemetry, if you will, is through two main contributions. So the first piece is the activity. So how likely was it to happen? Because if this is something that happens all the time, I'm probably going to associate a lower weight with it versus if it's something that never happens, then maybe it's of more interest. Again, we're looking for anomalous activity, so things that are unusual. That's what we want to use to surface these threats. The second piece inside those big square brackets there, this is essentially a way of mathematically quantifying who did what with what thing. Okay, so those are kind of the three pieces, if you will, that tie into the basic thing here. So there's an entity that's doing something, and maybe it's a person. It could be an IP. It could be a machine. and they're doing something to something, so an asset, so maybe I'm touching a file, maybe I'm sending something to a recipient email address, and then there's the thing, or sorry, how I'm actually doing that. So am I posting something over HTTP? Am I attempting to use a renewable Kerberos ticket to do something? There's all the specifics around how it actually happens. But basically, we have a way of combining this together to actually compute a risk of that event happening. So that's great. That means I'm going to be getting probably, order of hundreds of millions of these per day. That's how many events are going on in my networks. That's not something I'm going to look through, even if I sort rank them by the most riskiest at the top all the way down to the bottom. So the second piece we do is what you see in the bottom, your bottom left here, which is where we actually roll this up together for an entity. So we take all of your behaviors that have been going on. So I do tons of things on a daily basis. I go and use Google Drive for a while. I send some emails. I put some data onto a USB stick, et cetera, et cetera. And what we're able to do is actually accumulate all of those risky activities, which may or may not actually be risky, and roll this up into being a score for that entity by integrating that over time and summing it up across all those different types of events. So again, don't worry about the specific math details, but that's the basic process. You individually identify the riskiness of an event, and then you want to sum it up or integrate that up for an entity over a period of time so that you can figure out how risky have they been over that period of time. So that's fine as far as the mathematics go of it. You can imagine that kind of makes sense in terms of the process. But how am I going to make use of this? Let me back up. Let me unfold what's inside these square brackets in a bit more detail, and I'm going to use this do that using words as opposed to actually trying to break down the mathematics. So how do I actually assess what is the risk of an activity happening? So I gave you some examples of I sent 10 megabytes of email attachments to my personal email address. That doesn't really matter. The number 10 doesn't really matter that much, right? 10 megabytes. What really matters is that unusual or not unusual for me? Okay, in terms of if I'm trying to assess how risky is that behavior. As a whole organization, maybe sending 10 megabytes of data, that's nothing. That happens all the time. We have marketing people who send out big, huge decks and promotional pieces. We have some field technicians that are sending out tons of data. So maybe 10 megabytes doesn't actually matter. What matters is the riskiness of that particular activity should really be tied back to, is that what Roy normally does or not? So we have this concept of unique normal or baselining per entity. So what this means is actually learning and identifying and modeling so we can get the right kind of calculation in that big square bracket mathematical formula I showed there, so that you actually understand and can quantify each individual entity's activities. Now this is where there's a departure from more of the traditional approaches where, I want a rule that triggers if anybody sends over a gigabyte of data to an external email address in a single day. Sounds like a very sensible rule to have, especially if you're worried about people exfiltrating data over email. But inevitably, that trigger is going to get sent off or fired as a result of some sort of legitimate business process by somebody who actually works in that space and does this thing. And you kind of have two choices then. If you're going to continue using rules, then you need to consider whitelisting those people or potentially increasing your threshold because your analysts have stopped paying attention to that actual triggering result because of that. Or what you can do is move to a model in which you actually learn individual behavior so that you can figure out, is that unusual or not for that person? So this concept of having a baseline of unique normal, or the concept of actually understanding each individual, that's kind of the basis upon which we build all of our machine learning algorithms. So I've talked a little bit about some of the types and techniques. So we use unsupervised machine learning. So we have no labels in our approach to dealing with artificial intelligence. So there are no known activities that we treat that are known to be bad. Instead, what we do is simply measure what does everybody do, and then look for deviations from what they normally do. Some of the value we're able to bring is we have support for many different types of data sources out of the box. So you often hear about something called feature engineering or feature extraction. It's one of those things that happens using machine learning. So one of the first things you do, right, is these are all log files, right? Math does not necessarily understand what a log file is. A log file is wonderful for reading, always, but sometimes for reading as a human. But how are you going to make that thing consumable by an actual algorithm, by an actual AI process? So we have a bunch of feature extraction that just works out of the box, works across all these different data sources, which is constantly growing. And we're able to feed these into our different types of baseline anomaly models to detect behaviors that change based on those data. So I won't go into the detail here, but we have something called volumetric models. So my example of Roy sent 10 megs of email versus Norbert sending 1 meg of email, that's a change in volume. I went from 1 to 10. We have ways of detecting that. We also have pardon me, probability distribution estimation. So this can detect things like if I'm working at a weird hour of the day. So maybe I normally work 9 to 5, I wish, and then suddenly start working at 3 a.m. on a Friday night. What's going on with that? So we can detect that kind of thing too. And on the right-hand side, like I mentioned before, we bring this all together for a single person. And in our case, we're really focused on that end user analyst who wants to have a prioritized set of leads. So the end deliverable of what we're doing here is producing actually just a number, a risk score between 0 and 100. And the nice part about this is because as an analyst, I can understand what that number means to me in terms of where I should be looking. I know that if I look at a guy that's ranked with a 96 score, is more riskier than a person ranked with number 80. I don't know what the 96 means. I got to dig into it. I got to take that thread and I've got to pull on that thread and actually try to figure out, is this really worth my time? Is this not worth my time? But at least I have this ranked order list that allows me to use my time more efficiently. We already talked a little bit about this, about why we need unique normal. I touched on it in terms of the fact that you need to really have a way of dealing with the fact that common thresholding mechanisms don't really work, especially at scale, especially as we see more and more examples where standard business processes tend to really make this impossible to deal with. So I'll just share a few examples from some of our customers where this really starts to pop up. So one example, for instance, USB devices. I think it was IBM recently announced that you cannot use any USB devices with any of their systems anymore. Wonderful from a security point of view. The security professional in me is all on board with that, but I know many organizations that would grind to a halt if you actually force that upon them. It's too much a part of how they actually work. So again, being able to learn what the standard baseline activities are for your individual employees or entities is really important so that you're not constantly spitting out tons of false positives. For example, with USB devices, if I'm constantly actually uploading my technical product documentation to a USB drive to give to the customer, that's a big no-no, right? Like from a security professional point of view, how do I know it's just documentation? That seems like a really, really big risk. But this is part of business processes, and so it's not about to go away. We see other examples too with malware activity, often where we have cases where I've got some malware attempt to actually go across my network traffic, get in access into my system. It's being blocked by my firewalls, but it's being blocked so reliably I don't actually spend any time taking a look at it, but I want to detect when volumes change or when behavior changes, because then maybe it's worth my time actually taking a look at it as opposed to when it's just functioning like normal. I mentioned at the very start about how big data was both some of the challenge in terms of the fact that this makes it more and more enticing for people to steal your data, but it's also a property of how we end up protecting against it because we end up generating lots of this big data. We find that at least the approach that we take in using unsupervised machine learning, it would be impossible without big data. This is why we chose to build our stack on top of the Hadoop stack. Because without all that data, none of this stuff works. You cannot determine someone's normal behavior if you're not looking at tons and tons and tons of their data, looking at all of those Active Directory logs, looking at all of their uploads, looking at all of their endpoint telemetry. All of this stuff is critically important for you to actually be able to detect and quantify what's going on as a result of that. So I took you down a ride talking a bit about the math, the machine learning. I see mostly wide awake faces still. So let me just reset. If you zoned out over the last 10 minutes, we're going back into the business part of the conversation. I'm not going to be talking about the math anymore. So again, what's the problem we're trying to solve here, right? We're trying to solve the problem, the fact that we have way too much data to take a look at, to understand, to synthesize as an analyst. I need to be able to somehow triage this down into something that makes sense so that when I'm spending my precious time, I'm working on the right things. And so this is the basic triage process we go through as part of our approach to dealing with pardon me, cybersecurity analytics. I won't spend time on this slide just because this is stuff that's pretty standard as far as threat hunting and cyber analytics goes, as far as the kinds of things you look for as a security analyst. We're looking for things like data breaches, that's data staging, exfiltration, looking at IP theft, which I'll talk about in our case study examples, transactional abuse. These are the kinds of things that are problems, and these are the kinds of things you want your security professionals finding. So let's talk about case studies. Again, I'm a bit limited in terms of how much information I can share, so I will provide what I will provide what I know I can say, and if you guys want to ask questions afterwards, I will do my best to answer. So this first case study here, this was a large manufacturer. They were really interested to understand whether or not if they were having any of their proprietary IP being stolen. And they spent a lot of money trying to do this. They were a globally distributed company, so they had offices all over the place. And they were really worried that they were having some of this information being stolen, but they didn't have any way of determining if they could find out, getting an affirmative answer. They would check, they would look at their existing technologies, they tried some new technologies, and it came saying, no, you're not having anything stolen from you. Well, no, you mean you couldn't tell me if you found anything I was having stolen from me. With these folks here, we got involved, and really some of the signals started to jump out of the data almost immediately. We identified 2 engineers that were actually stealing some of their source code. This popped out very naturally by looking at their normal behavior in terms of how they were cloning and pulling from their source repositories versus what their peers were doing as a result. And so suddenly it just jumped out. The signal was bright as day, but if you just looked at their overall behavior, it was in line with what other people were doing as well. It was really by looking in and actually quantifying what is their normal behavior themselves and looking for deviations from that allowed us to detect this. And then this expanded into being able to detect a few other cases of data theft as well. This is the case study where I can actually mention the name. So this is Midnight Oil. They do graphics development for media companies. In this case here, the work we were doing with them was really focused around endpoint visibility into what people were doing on their machines. So this company here, they worked on the Star Wars films. They were involved in some of the production associated with that. You may remember there was a Star Wars leak that happened at one point. And based on some of the telemetry they were working with, the actual analytics they could apply, they could actually verify that they were not involved in part of that process, so that they could actually have affirmative proof that we were not involved in that leak that actually happened as a result of having this information available and the fact that they were actually looking for people to make sure they were not stealing any data from their systems. Number 3, a healthcare records and payments processor. So these folks here, they're involved in the intermediate stage that happens between when you have a medical procedure either requested or a prescription to fill, and then you actually go to someone to get that filled. So from your doctor. Sorry, I'm from Canada, so I don't know all the terms down here. But it goes from having your doctor who prescribes something or orders something, and then you actually go somewhere else to get that filled out. Along the way, this company here is involved in the actual mediation of that, so they actually do the bookkeeping, if you will, from the ordering to the actual reimbursement back to the doctor and all that kind of stuff. So in this case here, they handle huge amounts of transactions, 6.5 billion transactions, and it's healthcare data. And I'm sure, unless you've been living under a rock, you're well aware of healthcare ransomware, healthcare data breaches. Healthcare data is very valuable. If you actually look at it on the scale of which data record is the most valuable one to go after, healthcare is actually ahead of financial data. So it's better to steal your personal medical record than it is to go and steal your bank record as it stands today on the black market or other nefarious places. But these folks, again, limited resources. They're a team of 7 that are working to protect this network and protect this data. So working with them, in this case here, we were actually able to help them identify an employee who was attempting to move sensitive data to their own personal Dropbox. Again, a sudden spike in activity that was very different compared to what they normally did, moving large amounts of data across. The total volume of data was not that much compared to how much data actually flowed across the network on a typical day. But when you drilled into that individual person, you really did see that massive spike of unusual activity. And before leaving this slide, I just want to emphasize one thing here in terms of how they quantified the impact of what a tool like this can do. So again, I've been talking a lot about making your analysts more efficient. So you want to give them tools that let them do their job better. In this case here, they found that they were able to quantify the incident and alert accuracy from 28% to 92%. So That means any specific thing they looked at previously was about 20% accurate, so 72% of the time they threw it away, said that was a waste of my time. That dropped down to 8% throwaway. So they might not be finding insiders, they might not be finding those big smoking guns. Hopefully they're not, right? You really hope you don't have these problems. But at least if you know you're not wasting your time pulling on different threads and you're pulling on the right threads, big improvement. And the corollary of that, of course, is that they had better incident mitigation coverage because they're spending more of their time chasing the right kind of thing. Last case study I'll mention here, similar theme. This is all, they're all kind of variations of each other since I can't get into the technical details of them. But this one here was a defense contractor. In this case here, there was an employee who was moving around, and I won't say the word smuggling, but otherwise misusing Microsoft Office files to move inappropriate content around. Thank you. So in this case here, not unusual for an employee to use Microsoft Word, use Microsoft PowerPoint. It was the images and content that they were putting inside those documents and then moving those files around that was inappropriate. And that's a hard thing to detect. I don't know how many of you have either endpoint or data profiling technology that's actually going into the documents and looking for specific patterns to be able to flag on, but if you're using this kind of common method of moving around data, just taking a screenshot, putting it inside of a Word document, hey, it's a Word document, we're all good to go. It's a very tricky thing to find, but again, when you see changes in behavior, this can give you that thread to pull on so that you can then drill in and actually find, like when you look at it and you see it, it's clear as day. But why would you pick that one Word document out of the other million that are being sent around that day to actually focus on? It's getting that spotlight, or that laser, if you will, to focus in on what you need to pay attention to. So to sum things up a little bit, hopefully I've managed to communicate some of the concepts and some of the capabilities in the AI cybersecurity analytics space. Again, really focused on the problem of insider threat. I didn't go into too much detail on the insider threat, but I should have really started by saying insider threat doesn't necessarily mean you have a bad person in your organization. It could mean that someone's account has been compromised by a bad person, and then they sure look like a bad person as part of that process. Even beyond that, you can have people that are not inherently bad, they're just, if I can use the word stupid. We see it all the time, users are the worst. They might be doing things that are really inappropriate, that are in violation of your IT policies, and it's not a very big step to go from doing something that's not the smartest thing to do to suddenly becoming a security risk themselves, or potentially exposing your networks and your data to other types of problems. So it's a more pervasive problem than just actually having that malicious person who's actually trying to explicitly do you harm. It does manifest in different ways. So with that, I will close with 5 minutes to give you back to go and enjoy the venues and the expos and the food. I'm happy to take any questions, but thanks very much for your attention. I'll take that as a win that it was a very clear conversation. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so the question, just to repeat it, is, and if I got it correct, is if someone's been only ever exhibiting these bad behaviors, then how could you ever know that that's unusual for them? Is that an accurate replay? Yeah, that's absolutely a challenge, right? If you only have been looking at data that is itself the bad behavior, then you're not going to pick up the continued bad behavior as being something unusual. The approach we take, and there's a couple of different ways of going about it, is to look at peer groups. So typically, if you're doing something bad, your peers are hopefully also not doing something bad. So you can have both your comparison to yourself and your history, and that's what I focused on mostly here today. But you can also compare to other equivalent people too, to be able to pick that out. But it definitely does make it harder. Please. How do you handle seasonality? Seasonality, so changes in behavior over time?
So, for instance, if you're looking for if you're trying to baseline an anomaly, your network may behave differently, or users may behave differently at 9 a.m. on a Monday versus 3 a.m. on a Saturday.
Right, so I think the question, if I can replay it for the microphone, is how do you deal with temporal changes of activity? So if I behave differently at 9 a.m. on a weekday versus how I behave at 3 a.m. on a Saturday, how do I square that angle? Right, so a couple of different ways. So our approach to dealing with that, we have time-based models, period, that just look for when are you active. So we kind of decouple the problem. So you were active doing something at a particular time. So we break that down into you were doing something at a time. I don't care what. You were doing something at a time, though. And then we can build up a profile of that so we can determine is 3 a.m. usual or unusual for you. So that's one piece of weak indicator. The second piece we do is we actually don't even keep in the time in which something happens. We just build up a distribution of what you do and whether or not that's usual. So if at 3 a.m. you were mounting a file share and at 9 a.m. you were mounting a file share, those both contribute as you mounting file shares. So we lose that bit of data. So we definitely lose some of the fidelity of the signal and the strength of it. But what we're relying on is that there's going to be an accumulation of these patterns over all the things you do and over an appropriate period of time that's going to then boost you up in terms of your unusualness.
So that makes sense for the exfiltration, right? 'Cause if you're exfiltrating like a gigabyte and you normally send a megabyte, kind of rare.
Yeah,
Some of the other stuff maybe is more sensitive.
absolutely.
I didn't know if you guys had scalability issues around that. 'Cause it's a tough problem.
No, it's
Sensitize the data that way.
for sure. Yeah. Yes.
So the case studies which you shared with us, it's specific ones and quite different, right? So when you handle those kind of problems, do you learn from one case and actually apply that to enhance your model, and so that your model is straight away pointing at, okay, that's the issue because I learned already from this instance, or it's a typical no-no because it's customized case by case basis?
Right, so I think the question is, do we enhance and learn the product so it covers all of these cases as we learn more and more about it, or is it very much a focused thing on each?
Like a snowball fashion, so you learn
Yeah.
how to create and apply that.
Right, so our generic approach at a high level is to grow the capability of the product so we have more and more coverage. Every customer we have, we're a startup company, and so every customer we have, we learn lots from their environment, their problems, and their experiences. So we are constantly adding that capability, period. However, not everybody is the same in terms of the types of behaviors that matter to them. So for instance, some of our customers are way less concerned about abnormal Active Directory activity that we see. So for instance, if we see cases where there's lots of failed authentications or odd Kerberos-induced things going on within their authentication system, other customers really care about that. So there's a relative weighting in terms of the pieces of evidence. So when I pull in that thread and I see 2 or 3 pieces of evidence, different customers care more about different pieces of evidence along the way. So, and, I showed that one slide that had like the 8 or 10 different data sources we have. They're not all equal for all customers. Some care much more about specific things than others. So that, I would say, is different, but the overall capability very much does grow as a snowball. All right, I think we're out of time. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for sticking out the day. And please pop by and chat with me if you want. I'll be sticking around for a few minutes.